Hello. We're continuing our study in 1 Samuel. We're going to be in chapters 27 and 28 today. The first is David's experience with the Philistines, and the second is the tragedy of Saul with the witch of Endor. Let's begin in chapter 27. Then David said to himself, "Now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul." This chapter 27 is really an expansion of what David has said in chapter 26:19. He's afraid that Saul can't be trusted. He knows the Lord is somehow intensifying this what should I call it? Cleavage between himself and Saul, and so he decides to leave the country. So David rose and crossed over, he and 600 men, and went with him to Achish, the king of the son of Moab, king of Gath. Now this is kind of funny. Back in chapter 21, verses 10 through 15, this is the guy that David acted crazy with. Scribbled on the wall, let the spittle run down his beard. Now this guy welcomes him. How can that be? Well, when you have 600 armed men with you, you get a different reception from one of these mercenary type kings like this guy. Now, I'm not sure it's the same guy. It probably is, although this term Achish can be a name, a throne name like Pharaoh or Hadad or those kind of things. We're just not sure. It's exactly the same one. There's another one of these, matter of fact, in 1 Kings 2:39, which has got to be a later one by the same name. And David lived with Achish in Gath, and Gath, of course, one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. He and his men, each with his household. Now that must have meant 600 men with all their family, wives, and servants, and we're talking about close to 2,000 people. That's a lot of folks to feed. And even David with his 2 wives, and here his 2 wives are mentioned. This first one is exactly the same as Saul's wife, and they're the only 2 by this name in the whole Bible. But the fact that Saul's not dead yet, surely this can't be Saul's wife, right? No. And then Abigail that he got when his encounter with Nabal earlier. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. He wasn't militarily able to foray into the Philistine territory. Then David said to Achish, "Now if I have found favor in your sight, then give me a place in one of the cities in your country that I may live there, for why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" Well, that's pretty good for 2 reasons. Number one, this has been something we found in some of the early documents of the 2nd millennium BC, that these Hebrew, which is not Hebrew, but Hebrew, some of these nomadic Semites did. They came and helped somebody militarily and asked for a parcel of land for their military help. That seems to be what's happening here. I think David also wanted to be away from the capital city where he could support his men by plundering, but not plundering Judah, but plundering some of the enemies of Judah. And he had to have rather some freedom away from the view of the Philistine monarch to do that. And so Achish is going to do it. So Achish gave Ziklag. Now we don't know where Ziklag is. It's in southern Judah somewhere on the border between Judah and the Philistine area. It originally is listed in the tribe of Judah, Judges 15:31. But even before that, it was in the tribal allocation of Simeon, Joshua 15:31 and Joshua 19:5. Simeon, the tribe, is incorporated into Judah. Kind of loses its identity. And Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now, the fact that it says kings of Judah here tells me that whoever put together 1 Samuel as in its final form lived after 922, because the kingdom split in 922, and that's where there were kings of Israel and kings of Judah before it, just a king of Israel. And so it has to be written after 922, and the little phrase "to this day" shows it's written by a much later editor. And the number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was, now literally the Hebrew has a year and 4 months. You might want to see chapter 29, verse 5. The Septuagint has just 4 months, and why it has that, I'm really not sure. Josephus says 4 months and 20 days. There's a little Hebrew idiom here that can be seen in Leviticus 25:29 and Judges 17:10. It has to be a year and 4 months, and I think that fits the historical setting much better. Now David and all his men went up and raided. Now he's going to list 3 sites that David raided, and the reason it's in here is this author wants to prove that David never hurt his own people. First, it's the Gershites. There's a lot of different translations here. We're not exactly sure who these folks are, but they seem to be identified with the Philistines. They're mentioned back in Joshua chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, as Canaanites that were never defeated by Joshua. And so you can see they were still powerful military folks. And then the Girzites, and there's a lot of variety of how to spell this. We know nothing about them, and I just can't go any further than that. And then the Amalekites, with this old traditional enemy of the Jews. Saul wiped out a bunch of them, but they were independent tribes, that semi-nomadic, very hard to kill all of them at one time. And here was another group of them. The inhabitants of the land from ancient times, as you come to Shur. Now Shur is a wilderness between the land of Goshen and the Philistine area. So it's that northern area close to the Mediterranean, Shur, and then all the way as far as the land of Egypt, desert nomads in that area. And David attacked the land, and he did not leave a man or a woman alive. He took away the sheep, cattle, donkeys, and camels, and the clothing, and he returned and came to Achish. Now, why did David kill everybody? Well, there are several possibilities here. It's mentioned in verse 11 that he killed them so they would not have any witnesses that he was really killing off the Philistine allies, and also at the same time the enemies of the people of God. So the no witnesses has to be an obvious reason, verse 11. Some would say, though, since he killed everybody but took the spoil, this is something like the holy war of the book of Joshua. Now, there may be some truth to that because, as I told you, these Geshurites and Amalekites are traditional enemies of Israel that were fought during Joshua's day, and maybe David sees himself as continuing the conquest of Joshua, and he uses the holy war concept. I'm just not sure. Number 3, I think it has to be said that he's doing this for his large group of men to survive. He has to have these cattle and spoils to feed this 2,000 or so group. So he's doing it for practical reasons, for theological reasons, and he's doing it to survive, right? Now, why does he come to Achish every time? Well, apparently he had to give some of the spoil to this Philistine king. That was part of the deal. And Achish says, "Where have you made your raid today?" And every time David came, he asked the same question. And David's going to lie again. Boy, David is a liar. It's amazing he can be called a man after God's own heart. When you see all the things David did and said, that shows you that we're sure not right with God because of what we do. Woo! But because of his heart. Now look at this. And David said, against the Negev of Judah, and against the Negev of, I don't know how to pronounce that, and against the Negev of the Kenites. Now, all 3 of these are identified with Judah. Negev means the dry. It's the land south of Beersheba, and so it's the desert area. Some pasture land for camels and stuff, but not for cattle. Now, when it says the this first name, basically this is a tribe within Judah, and we see that in 1 Chronicles 2:9 and 1 Chronicles 2:25 and 26. Now the Kenites have often been associated with Judah. Matter of fact, Caleb and Othniel were Kenites, and so here we have David saying, "I've been killing off these Judah type folks." And so Achish would say, "Good, he's estranged from his own people now. He's going to be loyal to me because he's killed his own people, and that'll make him odious to them." Well, that's what he thought. And David did not leave a man or woman alive to bring to Gath, saying, lest they should tell the king of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, and he has surely made himself odious among his people Israel. Therefore he will come and be my servant forever. And that's the theory there. Now chapter 28 is the startling story. Also, by the way, chapter 28 is out of chronological order because it's obvious that 28:4 is later than 29:1, the camp of the Philistines as they move north. I think we're kind of left in suspense here as David's with the Philistines. We don't know quite what's going to happen. And then we see the terrible, terrible decline of Saul. And it came about in those days, the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Now know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men." Now David's going to be put on the spot. Here he is going to have to fight his own people. What's he going to do? How is he going to get out of this? He's been covering up, but he can't any longer. And David said to Achish, "Very well, You shall know what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. He really got caught up in David's lies. And maybe he said, after I see what you do in this battle, then I'll make you my bodyguard, something like that. Well, about this same time, something else was happening in Israel. Now, Samuel was dead. That same thing's been said back in chapter 25, verse 1, but we're going to call him up from the dead in this chapter, so it reminds us he is dead. And all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah. That's his city. And Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. Now, a medium and a spiritist are basically those who try to contact the realm of the dead or know the will of God by employing some kind of familiar spirit. You might want to see Leviticus 19:31, Leviticus 20:27, and Deuteronomy 18:10 through 12 for the condemnation of these groups within Israel. They're mostly known among the Canaanites, and Israel was to be different than the Canaanites. The very fact that Saul is going to remove these from the land shows that he did have a love for God, and he did understand in his early life what God wanted. So the Philistines gathered together and came and camped at Shunem. Now this is in the tribal allocation of Ishkar. We learned from Joshua 19:18, and it's going to be up to the north. Matter of fact, pretty close to the valley of Jezreel, very much to the north, which shows how far the Philistines had conquered up there. We even have some archaeological confirmation of Philistine settlements way to the north. We're not sure if it's during the period when they were Egyptian mercenaries or when they just did it on their own. Notice where it mentions then, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and he camped at Gilboa. Now Gilboa is up on a kind of a higher place. He can see a long way down in the Philistine camp in verse 5, and it scared him to death. Now the problem was we're in the valley of Jezreel. The Philistines have chariots, and the Israelis don't. So there's a striking military advantage to the Philistines. Besides their huge number is their superior weaponry. Now, why would Saul take a chance to fight here? Well, he must have felt forced into it some way. Maybe the Philistines were trying to split Israel and divide and conquer kind of thing. We're not exactly sure why. And Saul inquired of the Lord, and the Lord did not answer him. Saul wanted to know what God's will was, what to do in the face of this kind of odds. And so he does it three ways. He dreams, that meaning God revealed to him directly, or God revealed to someone else in his entourage. By Urim, and of course that refers to the Urim and Thummim. Now we know that Abiathar took the Urim and Thummim with him when he fled to David after the destruction of the priest at Nob. Maybe Saul had another one made, another two. And by the prophets. Now Samuel was dead, and he had alienated himself from the prophets. He had cut off himself from the priest, and now he wanted a word from God. What a sad, sad state of affairs. Then Saul said to his servant, seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor. Now how did they know? They must have, all of them must not have been run out. Now Endor is behind the Philistine lines. It's kind of the other side of the mountain. It's a dangerous trip. But Saul's desperate, and he's ready to go. It's a long trip behind enemy lines. Oh my. We learned from Joshua 17:11 through 13 that this particular city was a Canaanite city that apparently was not conquered during the conquest. Maybe that explains the presence of this medium there. I'm not sure. Then Saul disguised himself. Now who is he disguising himself from? The witch or the Philistines? I don't know. The truth is he's hiding himself from God. By putting on other clothes, and went he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night, and said, conjure up for me, please, and bring up for me whom I shall name to you. Now this bring up for me implies that this is the traditional view that the dead lived in the center of the earth in a place called Sheol. Now we know that's not true. We've dug all wells, nothing down there but hot molten lava and stuff. Does that mean the Bible's not true? No. The Jews, when they had loved ones die, they buried them in the ground. It's a way of speaking in common popular terminology. It's the language of the idiom, and so they put them in the ground. That's where the dead live. So they talk about conjuring up the dead. But the woman said, behold, you know what Saul has done and how he has cut off those who are mediums. The word cut off usually means killed. Those who remain, me and spirits of the land, why are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? This woman she may have been a medium, but she didn't recognize who these folks are till later. But she was weary about doing this for strangers, especially 3 men who come by night. A little wary. And Saul vowed to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, there shall be no punishment come upon you for this thing. My soul, what an ironic oath. Saul swearing in Yahweh's name not to kill a medium. He had already cleared the land of mediums, and now he's come to a medium to find information, and then he swears in God's name he won't kill her. Doesn't that just slap you in the face with irony? Tragedy. I was going to mention here, in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 13, this very thing, Saul going to this witch, is used as one of the reasons why Saul was rejected. Now, we know earlier he's rejected because of the Amalekite thing in chapter 13 and offering sacrifice in 15. And then 1 Chronicles 10:13 says this is another reason that confirms that God was fair in judging Saul. And the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. Whew, no little person. And the woman saw Samuel. She cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. Now, there have been a lot of theories about this. What exactly happened here? Some say that this is a demon thing, that is a false spirit that looked like Samuel is going to speak for Samuel. Others say, well, she's a fake. That's what it is. She just manipulated and is tricking Saul. Others say it was just his mental state that caused him to wish that she brought up Saul. But folks, I want to tell you, it looks to me like the guys are going to speak just like just like Samuel would speak. Looks to me like the woman in verse 12 is surprised that it's working. I think when she saw Samuel, she recognized this was far beyond her ability, and that God is going to use this occasion to speak to Saul. I heard somebody say, how does God reveal himself to man? Any way God chooses. You mean God could even choose a medium? I think he did. Does that mean that you can that this is a biblical affirmation for mediums and necromancers and all that, witches, wizards? Of course not. This is a tragedy. But I think it blew this woman's mind that Samuel really did come. Notice she calls him, I see a divine being coming up out of the earth. Now this divine being is the term Elohim, usually translated capital G God, as in Genesis 1. But it can also mean earthly judges, angels, spiritual beings. And here in this context, it obviously means some kind of departed person. That seems to mean some kind of angelic being. And it's surprising that the word coming up, the verb here is plural. Maybe Samuel's being brought by angelic host. Maybe Samuel's being brought in the company of others. We're just not sure. How did she know it was Saul? Well, if you were a lady and knew what was happening, and a tall man came and asked you something, and Samuel started coming out of the grave to talk to him, who would you think it was? You're right. And he said to her, what form? And she said, an old man coming up. Now the word old is very interesting. By the way, before I go to that, in verse 13 it says, coming up out of the earth. In both Ugaritic and Akkadian cognates, this word means the underworld. And I think that's what we're not just out of the earth, but from the underworld. Sheol, the realm of the shades, the grave, the pit. And then in chapter 14, the word old man. Well, he was an old man, but this word can mean, at least the Septuagint has the word erect, standing up. Someone was coming out, not laying down, but standing up, coming out of the underworld. And he was wrapped in a robe. Now, he didn't wear the usual mantle of a prophet. Samuel, from the very beginning of his life, his mother made him robes as he grew older. Apparently, he wore a robe, and Samuel seems to be characterized by that, and Saul recognizes him. And Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Maybe he recognized the robe. I'm not quite sure. Again, I want to say that there's been a lot of theories. The Septuagint, the Talmud, and Josephus think this is a real conjuring up act, that God did it, but he did it to reveal his will to Saul. Others say, no, it's demonic. And that would be Tertullian, Augustine, Luther, and Calvin all said it was a demon. His mental state is a Jewish commentator named Maimonides. Said it's his mental state. He just assumed this and saw this as a vision. I really think there's something to that. I think there is power in the demonic. I'm not sure if God did this to speak to Saul, or if this lady was shocked that her ability went so well. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me?" This word is used for robbing graves, disturbing the underworld. And Saul answered, "I am greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me." That's right. Chapter 16, verses 13, 14. Chapter 18, verse 12. This is what God said he would do. Now Saul's reaping the consequence of his sinful acts. He's a pitiful figure here. The man of God, so longing from a word from God, he's even willing to go to a witch. He knows it's going to be judgment, but he'd rather have a word from Samuel, even if it's judgment. What a pathetic sight. "And answers me no more, neither through the prophets or dreams." You mentioned the Urim and the Thummim. Probably the Jews say he's embarrassed about his slaughter of the priest at Nob. "Therefore I called to you, that you may make known to me what I should do." And Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and become your adversary?" It's the same word often translated Satan in some passages. You're fighting against God here, Saul. "And the Lord has done according to as he spoke through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand." That goes back to chapter 15, verses 27 and 28. Some have even said the reason that Saul knew it was Samuel is because of this robe. And this chapter 15, 27, and 28 is that robe that apparently Saul tore when Samuel turned to leave, and he grabbed it and tore it. Maybe Samuel was still wearing that torn robe, do you think? Well, this torn the kingdom seems to be an allusion to that. "And has given it to your neighbor." Now here, the neighbor is specifically named. You might want to see chapter 15, verse 28. "As you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek." Now that goes back to chapter, I believe chapter 13 where that is. Let me look back just for a second. I think it's 13 is Amalek, and I think 15 is where he offered the sacrifice. Or have I got that backwards? I may have that backwards. Well, anyway, Saul's rejected twice. The first time I think is because he offered a sacrifice in 13. Second time in chapter 15 is when he doesn't kill all the Amalekites. And he's judged for that. And it's been plain that first his descendants were judged in 13, and then he was rejected as being king in 15. This is an allusion to that. You might want to see 15 verses 9, 20, and 26. Now, "Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel with you into the hands of Philistines. Therefore tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Oh my, meaning you're going to be in Sheol. You're going to die tomorrow. Now the Septuagint slightly changes this to "you will fall, your sons will fall with you." Now we don't know why the Septuagint is different. The Masoretic text makes sense here. "You will be with me in Sheol." That's a new, very graphic kind of picture of Saul's death. But the other one makes sense too. You and your sons will fall. Your dynasty will be cut off tomorrow. Well, Saul, this sounds like something Samuel would say. This sounds like something Samuel has said. I think it's Samuel. Now, of course, what bothers me about this is, does a witch have the power to call up even God's men from the grave? I think only with God's help and for God's purpose, and no, not normally. I do believe a lot of the palm readers kind of witches we see are just fakes. I also believe there are some that use the power of the demonic to trick people about talking to the dead. God used this time. That's not setting a precedent. The pitiful thing is here is a man who wants to know speak a word from God, but he has to go to an unauthorized, condemned source that can't even provide it. But God does speak. In 20 through 25, we have a sad picture of Saul just wiped out. He hadn't eaten all day, whether it was a religious fast or he was just so excited and busy and worried about the Philistines. He had gone all these miles over here, snuck through, heard this terrible judgment oracle. Now the man falls flat on his face and he can't get up. He's just washed out. He's wiped out. Some make a big deal about the woman came to him, meaning the woman was in the other room calling up her spirits. I don't know if we can push the text that hard. I don't know how crystal ball, smoke, lights, and bells. I'm not sure of all that. But she comes to Saul and says, "Boy, you look bad, fella. Let me cook you something." And Saul says, "No, I'm not going to eat." And the men with him said, "You need to eat something, Saul." And she says, "You need to eat something." I think she recognized she didn't feed him. He was never going to leave. He was too tired. I think she wanted him out. So she kills an animal in the house and fixes it for him, and he eats, and then he goes his way. But isn't this a sad, pathetic fall of a man from being anointed to consulting wizards and witches? Saul is a tragic figure. I think he's a believer. He's just a tragic example of how, even with great blessings of God, that you can sin away those blessings by refusing to obey God and walk in His ways. David sinned. David did all the things, horrible things that, not the exact same things Saul did, but horrible things. And yet David had a soft heart. Saul was just kind of an irreligious man, though in his later years you see his longing for contact with God, that apparently the fellowship had been taken away from him. About this witch, I believe in the demonic. I believe there are those who are fakes. I believe there are those who truly have the power to do some pretty supernatural things. But it's from the power of the evil one. Although I think this is probably somehow connected in this unique instance to the power of God speaking to Saul through Samuel, this last word of judgment. Well, I've enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.